So if you're successful, then we would be at war with Russia now.
I actually think just the opposite. I think that, Senator, with regard to NATO membership, there's a very good reason that Russia has proved aggressive against countries that are not actually in NATO and under the umbrella, and a good reason why it's chosen not to attack.
This would be adding Georgia that's occupied to NATO under Article 5, then we would...
Someone just walked into one of the most powerful confirmation hearings in Washington and said out loud what no one in that room wanted heard. The questions are loaded. The silence will be deafening. Watch carefully.
Thank you. Like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, you've been a consistent supporter of military intervention in the Middle East, from the Iraq War to the Libyan War to the Syrian Civil War. Some on your side of the aisle, including the president-elect, have said, well, we were given bad intelligence. They misled us on the intelligence on Iraq. Now, that's a very specific reason. There's probably some truth to it, but I think it misses sort of the lesson of the Iraq War. Likewise, your justification for maybe coming to a new approach on the Libyan Civil War is, well, maybe we overestimated the idea of having viable successors there. To me, it seems like we're still missing the point, because even after Libya, you guys went on to Syria wanting to do the same thing again, and you've argued, well, maybe we just didn't do enough. If we'd done more, we could have toppled Assad and we could have had real regime change in Syria. Well, you got it in Iraq, you got it in Libya, and it's a disaster. The lesson of these wars is that regime change doesn't work. People say, oh, we're going to get rid of the iron fist, and Thomas Jefferson's going to arise from the ashes. Well, that is a naive notion to believe that Thomas Jefferson or his like live in Libya or live in Iraq. Their tradition is so much different than ours. I mean, we've been fighting against centralized power in the English tradition for 1,000 years. The revolution in England was 350 years ago. Ours was 250 years ago. That tradition they don't have. They have a tribal existence. You trade one for another. But mostly what you've gotten through the policies you have advocated, and Joe Biden has advocated, and frankly, John Bolton has advocated, this idea of regime change has been a disaster for the Middle East. We complain, everybody around here is concerned, Iran, Iran, Iran. Well, why is Iran stronger? Who's their best friend in the region now? Iraq. We did that. We had a balance of power. It wasn't perfect, but we had somewhat of a balance of power in the Middle East, and you guys messed it up. You got rid of the one bad guy, and another bad guy got stronger. And so then you went to Libya and did the same thing. And they said, well, maybe Libya's a one-off. Well, maybe there's a rule here. Maybe there's something we can learn about regime change, and maybe we can learn that humility would be that maybe we shouldn't be choosing every government in the Middle East. I would argue that instead of always choosing the governments, maybe we should not reward the bad ones. You know what I mean? So, for example, with Saudi Arabia, I despise the regime. I'd probably still trade with them. I probably wouldn't cut them off completely. I wouldn't sell many more arms. And after they killed Khashoggi, they shouldn't have got one bit of our armaments. But both sides advocate for this. On UAE, we tried to stop that because UAE has a terrible human rights record. Both sides support it. The problem around here is we have bipartisan consensus. The problem isn't lack of consensus. The problem is too much consensus, but the consensus is for regime change. Are any of the lessons you've learned from the failure of Iraq war, Libyan war, the chaos, the vacuum, and more terrorism that occurred and more lives that were lost, and then to go on to Syria? I don't get that there's been a lesson learned. Is there any kind of lesson learned on your part that regime change may not be the best thing for us in the Middle East?
Senator, I think we and I certainly have an absolute obligation to try to learn from everything we've done, advocated, to take into account the results, and to make that inform how we think about these problems going forward. And I've done a lot of hard thinking about some of the very situations you mentioned. I'm proud of the fact that I have spent all of my career during the times I've been in government, for the better part of 25 years, working to advance our diplomacy, to do everything we possibly can to make sure that diplomacy is the first answer, not the last answer, and that war and conflict is a last resort.
The next step was Syria. The next step was the Syrian civil war, which looks a lot like the Iraq war and the Libyan war.
In Syria, there were those who were advocating for a repeat of Iraq, which is to say a whole-scale intervention. That's something that I did not agree with. When we were looking at what to do in Afghanistan.
But here's the problem in Syria. There was a predictable result there. Had you gotten rid of Assad, who were the fiercest fighters over there? Al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda. The more radical you were, the better fighters you were. The program that you started with Hillary Clinton, the program to train the moderate rebels, we spent $250 million. We trained about 60. We sent 10 of them into battle, and they were captured in the first 10 minutes. It was a complete disaster. This whole idea that there were moderates over there that we were going to support, doctors and lawyers and stuff, there were, but I don't think they were out there fighting. The ones out there fighting were jihadists, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and if they'd have taken over the country, Assad's a terrible person, but I'm not positive that these people would have been better. So, I mean, it's the same lesson. Our humility has to be, let's quit toppling regimes over there. Let's don't support the bad ones, but let's don't presume enough that if we topple them, that in the vacuum, Thomas Jefferson is going to arise, because it never seems to happen. With regard to advise and consent, and this is a little bit on Senator Barrasso's extension of his question on treaties, it really isn't so much a solicitous mood to say, well, we just can't pass these treaties, so we're going to make all these agreements and they're not coming to you. But I would argue even more importantly on war. You have argued when you've been part of administrations that, oh, yes, you know, we'd like Senator Kane's, a more narrow AUMF, but we don't really need it. Now, you're not alone. That sort of, I think, arrogant executive sort of attitude comes from both parties. Every president for the last 50 years. In fact, they all probably believe this. They believe they have absolute power. It's called this absolute Article II authority. And this runs on both sides. But it runs through the extremes on our side. The John Boltons on our side believe in this absolute Article II authority. The AUMF from 9/11 had nothing to do with people in Somalia. Do you think the AUMF from 9/11 authorizes you to continue the war in Somalia?
I think the AUMF from 9/11 has been used in countries and against groups that were not contemplated or cited in the AUMF, which is the very strong reason why we should revisit it.
But it's very specific. It says people who organized to attack us. It doesn't mention, you know, people say, well, they say and associated forces. That's not in it. That's somebody dreamed that up later and sort of said that it's in. It's not in there. It doesn't say associated forces. There is no authorization for war in Somalia, Mali, Yemen, which the Obama administration originally did support. So there really isn't. And I'm not for a more narrow one. I'm just for no more war over there. I'm tired of all the war. I'm tired of all the nation building. Look, I love the rights of women as much as anybody, but if our goal is going to be that we're going to keep women in power, like in Saudi Arabia, we're going to go to war with Saudi Arabia because they don't have women ministers of health and stuff, you know, it really isn't exactly our national security that you're talking about. You're talking about something different. Now, from the point of view of the Secretary...
What just happened in that exchange is not a policy disagreement. It is a direct indictment of 40 years of bipartisan foreign consensus. Paul is not asking Blinken to reconsider a strategy. He is forcing him to defend a worldview that turned Iraq into an Iranian client state and Libya into an open arms market. Blinken cannot say Paul is wrong. He can only redirect. That redirection is the tell. The machine does not admit failure. It reframes failure as incomplete success and then asks for more runway. Are you still being told these wars were necessary? Or are you finally asking who actually benefited?
Secretary of State, there are things you can do through soft power to advocate for the principles we believe in. But overthrowing governments to instill women's rights or to continue women's rights and to continue a military presence there and fight battles for it is really not something that is in the purview of the Secretary of State or really under the Constitution to anyone in our government. With regard to NATO, you've advocated for expanding NATO. Do you still support putting Georgia in NATO?
If a country like Georgia is able to meet the requirements of membership and if it can contribute to our collective security, yes, the door should remain open.
So if you're successful, then we would be at war with Russia now.
I actually think just the opposite. I think that, Senator, with regard to NATO membership, there's a very good reason that Russia has proved aggressive against countries that are not actually in NATO and under the umbrella, and a good reason why it's chosen not to attack.
This would be adding Georgia that's occupied to NATO under Article 5, then we would go to war.
Well, I think we've seen, again, in the past that countries that have joined NATO have not been the same target of Russian aggression that we've seen.
We were talking about 20 years ago, we might have a valid argument now. Russia occupies Georgia. Russia occupies or proxy troops occupy part of Ukraine. So I think adding either of them to NATO not only is provocative, but you'd have to think what comes next. I mean, if we're obligated to defend our NATO allies, I mean, basically we'd be voting for war. So I wouldn't vote to add Georgia to NATO, not on your life, unless I'm ready to send my kids and your kids to go fight in Georgia. The complicated fights and wars and occupation around, and I just think that we need to think these things through. And I think for every provocation, there's a response as well. So we can't look at it in a vacuum. People say, I don't care what Russia thinks, or I don't care what Tehran thinks. Well, if we don't understand our adversaries enough to think how they will respond, then I don't think we're doing our job.
I agree with you.
But as you can tell, I'm not excited about more military intervention in the Middle East. I think there has been some chastening on the part of the incoming administration over previous failures. But I don't think you have completely gotten the idea that regime change has been a terrible disaster. It's created vacuums, chaos, and actually more terrorism throughout the region. So I hope you will consider that. It's important, not just for the philosophic point, but it's important for our kids. I mean, we're sending these kids over to fight in these wars that go on forever and ever and ever, and somebody's got to stand up. And I hope you will be somebody brave enough to stand up and stop some of this.
I appreciate what you said.
What you just watched was not a confirmation hearing, it was an autopsy of every military decision made in the Middle East over the last 2 decades, performed live, on the record, in front of the man being asked to continue the same policy under a new name. And the most damning part is not what was said. It is what could not be denied. Rand Paul did not lose his temper. He did not grandstand. He did not reach for a soundbite. He did something far more dangerous to the system. He asked a simple question and refused to let the answer be complicated. Did regime change work? The record says no. Every time, without exception. Iraq, Libya, the attempted unraveling of Syria. The math is the same. Remove the strong man. Watch the vacuum fill with something worse. Count the bodies. Call it a lesson learned. Then prepare to do it again. Blinken's answer was technically fluent and substantively empty. He said all the right words. Diplomacy first, hard thinking, lessons absorbed. But Paul caught it. The lesson Blinken claims to have learned from Libya is that they overestimated viable successors. Not that intervention itself was wrong, not that the premise was flawed, just that the follow-through needed work, which means the machinery is still running. The ideology is intact. Only the execution is under review. That is the tell. That is what should make you stop. But here is what nobody is asking in the mainstream coverage of this exchange. Why does this pattern survive every administration change? Iraq was a Republican project. Libya was a Democratic one. Syria stretched across both. And yet the same class of foreign policy architects moves from one White House to the next, from one confirmation hearing to the next, carrying the same assumptions in a different briefcase. Blinken was there for all of it. He was not a passive observer. He was an architect. And now he is being confirmed to do it again. Think about what this means if you are sitting on the other side of this. If you are a citizen of a country that was on the receiving end of this consensus, this bipartisan, well-credentialed, conference room-approved consensus, what does accountability look like to you? What does a Senate confirmation hearing look like when the man being questioned helped build the wreckage being described? Paul raises the Iran point, and it lands harder than anything else in that room. Before the Iraq War, Iran had a regional counterbalance. Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, no argument there, but he was also a wall. The moment that wall came down, Iran's sphere of influence expanded in ways that now consume billions in American defense spending every single year. The architects of the Iraq War did not create a democracy. They handed Iran its most significant strategic gift in a generation. And the people who advised that policy, who supported it, who managed its aftermath, they did not disappear. They got promoted. Why now? That is the question worth sitting with. Why is a man with this specific resume being confirmed as the top diplomat at this specific moment? The answer the establishment will give you is experience, steady hands, known quantity. But Paul's argument cuts directly against that framing. Experience at what? A track record of what? You do not get credit for experience if the experience is a consistent record of catastrophic miscalculation. Supporters of Blinken will say, and they are not entirely wrong, that the alternative to engagement is isolation, and isolation has its own body count. They will argue that the chaos in Libya was partly an outgrowth of what was already there, not solely a consequence of Western intervention. They will say Syria's civil war would have consumed hundreds of thousands of lives with or without American involvement, and that the question was never whether to intervene, but how. These are not dishonest arguments. They deserve to be heard. But critics, and Paul represents the most coherent version of this position from the right, argue that the burden of proof has never been applied fairly, that every intervention begins with a humanitarian justification and ends with a power vacuum, that the people making these decisions do not send their own children, that the communities absorbing the veterans, the suicides, the traumatic brain injuries, and the grief are not the communities drafting the policy memos. That is not a left-right argument. That is a class argument, and it is the one that never quite makes it onto the Sunday shows. What both camps are missing entirely is the structural question. This is not about whether any individual decision was right or wrong. It is about a system that produces these decisions repeatedly with the same logic, the same language, and the same class of decision-makers, regardless of which party holds the White House. The confirmation hearing is part of that system. The polite questions, the careful answers, the votes that mostly go through, the policy that continues. Paul ended that exchange with something that does not get said in those rooms very often. He said somebody has to stand up. He said we are sending these kids to wars that go on forever. And he said he hoped Blinken would be brave enough to be that person. He will not be. Not because Blinken is a bad man, but because the system does not select for that kind of bravery. It selects for continuity, for consensus, for the next administration and the one after that. The war machine does not need villains. It just needs a meeting quorum and a bipartisan majority. If this is the analysis you are not finding anywhere else, you already know what to do. This story is not finished. The names at the table change. The table does not. If you made it this far, subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop your take in the comments, because this conversation is far from over.